In today's vlog, I want to delve a little bit deeper into, I guess you would call it Norse revival reconstruction, or at least that's what a lot of people use. Some people call it Norse paganism, some people call it heathenry. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the different thought processes on rebuilding, reconstructing, or just making from scratch. There are some discussions around topics such as, is the path an open path or not? And I have mixed feelings on that. I've shared this in other videos. At a very high level, just understand that the way that I look at it is, at the end of the day, I don't really think too much of cultural appropriation because I think that anybody can do anything. And that stands for all cultures, but I treat them all equally. I don't care what the culture or tradition is. If you want to study it and adapt it, more power to you. And I think it's fascinating and fantastic that people find an interest in other cultures. With that being said, if you think any culture can be claimed and borrowing from it is cultural appropriation, the same will apply to a lot of the practices that are done within Norse paganism. These are cultural traditions that people are adapting. Now, when people adapt these practices, they have a tendency to mix in other traditions from other cultures. In Iceland, there's Seiðr, which is a reconstruction revival, where they're trying to bring back some of the old practices. After that started, there was a American movement that tried to use a similar name to Seiðr, which basically is faith in the Aesir, or so the Auses, the Aesir, Seiðr, faith in the old gods, basically is what it kind of comes down to. So it's a reconstruction to try to rebuild it. That is a modern term. It is not the old term. There wasn't an old term. It was part of the culture. It was ingrained into the people. And even if you take modern day Iceland, the way that people practice any religion, including Lutheranism, which is one of the major religions in Iceland, they do it in their own way. There are videos that you can check out here on YouTube where you can go and look at people being interviewed and being asked about certain topics, like who do they think Jesus was, as an example. And hearing the different responses or the way that the people live, you can tell the spirituality is ingrained into their culture, and they've adapted and applied foreign religions like Christianity in their own way and made it their own. Also, when you talk about things that are part of this reconstruction, you're talking about a group of people that explored. They went on Viking, which is like saying they went on a journey. Viking is something you would go on. Some people try to say it's an action. It's not an action. It refers to the actual journeying and traveling. And they did it for many reasons. They did it for raiding and trading and settling. They explored, but they've got a lot of different exposures. So the peoples themselves are used to adapting different ideas. It's part of that culture. With that being said, if you are practicing any form, you are using items that are part of these unique and robust and distinct cultures. I don't see a problem with it. A lot of people don't see a problem with it. Just be aware of that. So with that, when you are looking at trying to reconstruct something, because a lot of people are drawn to this and have an interest in it for various reasons. People have their own reasons for being driven to what inspires them or what they enjoy. Some of this could be from games or from movies or from TV shows because it's their first exposure to it. And they're like, wow, that's kind of cool. I want to know more about it. So then where do you find sources? Aside from going to the actual cultures where they come from. Again, it's important to understand that when you were talking about ideas, they are culturally built, and when other people adapt them, they change them. In a lot of the modern practices, people are adding in different outside practices that had nothing to do with the cultures of where they came from, and thus creating something new. And that is the case for a lot of these movements. There's no centralized government or governing body to say how you practice what I would call Scandinavian reconstructions. I would say reconstructions versus revivals because it never fully went away. It was just it became something else. And if you want to see what it is, like I said, you go to those actual countries and see how those people are living. That's what it has become because it's integrated. The idea and this concept of religion didn't really apply to the old Scandinavian Viking age people. It was part of everyday life. It was part of everything that they did. And you can see that reflected in sagas and eddas in history. This is what I'm basing this off of. My opinion around this is based upon looking into this stuff. When I was younger, there wasn't a lot of books and things available. There's plenty of stuff available now. Now, I myself, as I've mentioned in other videos, have a great interest because for all intents and purposes, I'm an Icelandic American. And the reason I say that is because my mother was born in Reykjavik, Iceland. She came over when she was 1, but she was born in Iceland. I grew up with my Amma speaking Icelandic accent. I didn't learn how to speak it. I was never taught. I was only taught English because I was born and raised in America. But it was part of everything that we did. It was ingrained in it. I was, given the fear of gorilla coming if we're not behaving ourselves around December. There was things that it was just part of every day. So I was always interested, as are my brothers, especially my younger brother. So I want to know more about it. Well, finally, we start getting people like Jackson Crawford who start releasing and translating things in English. Things become more readily available. There's tons of books to talk about with this, but today's focus, after that long 6-minute intro, is going to be The Viking Way by Neil Price. Now, this book was introduced to me through TikTok. There was a TikToker who recommended this. Now, the interesting thing is we're reading the same book, but we're coming up with different opinions on what it's referencing and referring to. And what I want to do is I want to delve into a few sections on this book really quick and share my opinion and kind of reinforce what I'm saying. And the entire point of this intro is that the way that the Viking Age individuals practice, first of all, we don't want to practice like they did. It's a different culture. It's a different time period. And whether it's part of your ancestry or not, like it is mine, doesn't matter. The point is, they were different peoples, and we have a different worldview today. So we are going to adapt it. The way we're doing it today is a modern way of doing it. It's important, in my opinion, to acknowledge that and be aware. So we're not doing what the Vikings did. We're doing what we have adapted from what remains. The other thing I want to point out is, even though this book says magic and mind in the late Iron Age Scandinavia, right, by Neil Price, it's not magic. And I've argued this many times. A lot of people try to look for a Viking Age word, whether it be a title, so they can call themselves something like Volva or Vitki, or they'll try to say, oh, well, what is magic from that era? It's a different concept. The whole concept of what magic is today does not apply to how they lived in the Viking era. And again, we see this attested in the sagas. Saga is Icelandic or Old Norse for story, and the Eddas. We see from written accounts that it was thought of differently. A lot of the accounts that were written after the Viking era. They didn't have full books and stuff in the Viking era. A lot of it, like Snorri Sturluson, 200 years after the Viking era, started writing a lot of this stuff down. So a lot of it was passed by word of mouth. So we have to take secondhand accounts after all this is passed, and we have to look at archaeology. The other thing to keep in mind is, what does the term magic actually mean? And I would reference back to Agrippa's definition of magic. And if we look at where that came from, it's a different concept. I have heard people refer to Nordic, Scandinavian revival reconstruction movement practices as shamanistic in nature. And I think that does reflect some of what they did as a people back then, to a degree. I don't know if I would use the term shamanistic, but it does have a closer reference. And if you look up the definition of what shamanism is and shamanistic, I can understand how they would apply that. It seems to me, from a lot of the research I've done through reading books like this, listening to other YouTubers, stuff by Jackson Crawford, stuff by William R. Short, I could almost understand, I think, a general basic idea that the Scandinavian people put a lot of stock into their relationship with nature itself, had reverence for the world, their environment, and their ancestors. And when they interacted with it, it was important to do things either symbolically, ritualistically, or through voice and sound, which is why you have certain practices today that are inspired by these. But we also need to be aware that certain outside influences, like this whole reading of runes, as far as I can tell, I can find no Viking Age references for actually reading of the runes. The way the runes are read today is modern adaptation. And I think a lot of that comes from not only things like the Icelandic rune poem, which I've shared in other videos, but it also comes from people who are trying to look at other cultures that do readings and then adapt it. And then we have to be careful because some of that stuff with reading of the runes or doing runic circles comes from individuals like Guido von List, who was associated with the National Socialist Party of Germany, also known as the Nazis. So we have to be careful, in my opinion, on what practices we want to keep alive and why we're doing it. Now, if you read the runes, fine. If it works for you, fine. Technically, you can read anything you want. You can grab dice and throw dice. You can grab sticks in your backyard and throw sticks. You can take chicken bones if you go out to KFC and keep the bones and throw them and toss them and try to read them. People apply and adapt principles universally, but just be aware things like that are going to be more modern. So the big argument is, what is Norse magic? And some people will say, Seiðr. Now, Seiðr is one specific type of practice. It's not an all-encompassing name for all of magic, period. People argue with me on this because of individuals like Ursula Dronka, who will translate Seiðr as magic. The reason I say that it doesn't translate directly is if we look at the Eddas, sagas, and cultures, or even the book The Viking Way, we'll see clear definitions of what Seiðr was. We'll see attested in like the Saga of Eric the Red, when we have a Volva coming in and actually performing Seiðr, we will see the unique practices that were involved and around it, what they actually did. For example, specifically with Seiðr, it seems to have been practiced by women. Men who did it were considered ergi, which is like very unmasculine word or name. It's almost like saying, I guess there's a lot of derogatory words that you could use for a very feminine man in a derogatory way. And again, different culture, the way they looked at things differently. And there were men who did practice it, and they were frowned upon, but it wasn't common. And the woman is described as wearing these animal skins and cat skin gloves and all this, and consuming parts of like an animal while she's doing the ritual and in getting her vision and sharing the information. And she's basically speaking to the spirits, and she had a dais she stood up on, and she's singing a song and looking for local women to help her sing the songs, specifically for performing her Seiðr ritual. Apparently there's ritualistic drum beating, but it had sound and singing. Voice and singing was very potent and powerful for the Viking Age. So again, that's one type, but then you had other type of things that individuals would do that would fall under other classifications that I don't think would be classified as Seiðr, thus meaning magic doesn't necessarily directly translate into English. So again, if you're looking to reconstruct and rebuild this stuff, you have to change your mind view. Otherwise, just do your own thing and borrow what you want and acknowledge where it comes from. So the parts that I want to bring up, because this is going to definitely be a longer video, is I want to start out by turning to chapter 2, page 34. Again, this is all going to be out of this book. I'm going to switch to my reading glasses here in a second, and I'll probably cut the video since it'll take me a minute to find it. All right, so the specific passage is on the left-hand side, about halfway down the page. The double word Seiðr and the problem of Old Norse magic. We have already seen how our modern concepts of religion are not necessarily compatible with those of the Viking Age, which is what I was just talking about earlier. We can make the same observations about the social environment of sorcery at the same period. The first problem comes at the level of apparently simple definition, which on a closer inspection turns out to be far from straightforward. And then it references other readings here. Today, we speak fluidly of magic and witchcraft, the working of spells and charms, all performed by sorcerers, witches, warlocks, wizards, and so on. In popular parlance, there is little to choose between any of these terms, but no one would link them with formal religion as it is generally perceived. In the early medieval period, the situation was very different in two ways. Firstly, there seems to have been a very precise vocabulary of sorcery, encompassing its forms, functions, practice, and practitioners. Secondly, through intimate links with divinities such as Odin and Freyja, and also in its underlying principles, which include some of the soul beliefs reviewed above, the whole structure of sorcery was interlaced with that of cult. And then it references Simic 1993-199, has perhaps come closest to illuminating this relationship when he writes of magic as the mentality, the practices with which the mechanisms of supernatural powers are set into motion. When defined in this way, it is clear from the written sources that one concept above others lay at the core of Old Norse concepts of magic. Its name was Seiðr, and its closer study will be central to much of this book. Seiðr would have been pronounced approximately Seith, rhyming with the modern English swath, but with a slightly inflected R sound at the end in the nominative form. Several scholars have noted that the etymology, it seems to belong to a group of Indo-European words with connotations of binding, especially in a sorceress context. And that, of course, is reference from Ursula Dronka. That's why a lot of people are saying, oh, magic and Seiðr are the same thing, right? It is described at length in a number of the Old Norse sources and circumstantially in a great many more. These are all reviewed in detail below, but at this point we can simply note that it seems to have been a collective term for a whole complex of practices, each serving a different function within the larger system of sorcery. There were Seiðr rituals for divination and clairvoyance for seeking out the hidden, both in the secrets of the mind and in the physical locations, for healing the sick, for bringing good luck, for controlling the weather, for calling game animals and fish. Importantly, it could also be used for the opposite of these, to curse an individual or an enterprise, to blight the land and make it barren, to induce illness, to tell false futures and thus to set their recipients on a road to disaster, to injure, maim, kill in domestic disputes, and especially in battle. More than anything else, Seiðr seems to have been an extension of the mind and its faculties, even in the battlefield context rather than outright violence. It mostly involved the clouding of judgment and freezing of the will, the fatal hesitation. It was also closely linked to the summoning of spirits and other beings of various kinds who could be bound to the sorcerer's will and then sent off to do her or his bidding, in line with the invisible population we have encountered above. An important category of these were extensions of the individuals in the manifestations of a multiple soul, the Fjölkynngi, Hamingr, and so on. The link to the cultic practices comes primarily through the god Odin. And it continues to talk about a whole bunch of these other things that were involved with it. But then if we continue reading, we go to page 35, and there's this other section here that is noted out. The other magics, Galdr, Galdr, and Odinic sorcery. And this is why I'm like, I can understand why some people think from reading that first part that Seiðr is just magic. But then we call out specifically on this next page here why it's potentially different or one of a category of classifications, right? So essentially there occur 5 categories of sorcery in the sources besides Seiðr itself. 3 of them were also named complexities of rituals and techniques, though apparently in a looser sense than Seiðr, while the others are modern constructions which derive from analysis of the text. So some of them were straight up Seiðr clearly, some of them were similar in some fashion, and then some of them are modern terms used to call out the differences based upon modern terminology to be like, well, this is clearly different than sagas. And that is Galdr, Gandr, Utiseta, a group of unnamed rituals connected through the abilities of the god Odin, hence the term Odinic sorceries, and a general background noise of popular magic, often unsophisticated or indeed completely unarticulated in a practical way, occurring throughout the literature. So basically, we're making references to a whole bunch of different types of magic that aren't necessarily Seiðr, which is why I'm saying they're classified differently, and this is why I'm defending my general idea of this could be different. One of the examples of this is in Eät Saga. I know I wrote it down. I'll have to look it up again here. Let me just grab it really quick because I take notes. I have to take notes. There's too much of this stuff. All right, specifically with the slaying of bards. So if you look up the slaying of bard in Eät Saga, there is a section there where he is handed a cup that has poison in it, and he cuts the palm of his hand, carves runes into the cup or horn, whatever he's drinking the mead from, and then he smears his blood on it and he sings a song. This, in my opinion, is an example of Galdr, even though it's not specifically called out, but it would not be classified as Seiðr based upon the other sources that we see in the other ways that Seiðr is referenced in the sagas and Eddas. So this would be an example of magic that is used differently. Now let's jump over this other section, which is also on page 35, and it says here, Galdr forms yet another distinct category here with the origins that go back much earlier than the Viking Age. The basic sense of the word is often argued to mean simply magic. So again, a word translated directly into magic, right? And De Vries has suggested that it can be related to the concept of Gnungagap. This is important as it suggests Galdr to be one of the primal forces from which the worlds were formed, and thus implies that this form of sorceress power was a considerable dignity. That this type of sorcery also had an earlier history is shown by tantalizing references from classical writings. For example, the name Ghana attributed by Dio Cassius in his Roman history. So again, it talks about all of these different things, and then there's the next paragraph. By the Viking Age, and as with Galdr, we find combinations of ritual forms in several instances where references to sorceresses using Galdr in conjunction with Seiðr. Again, in conjunction with Seiðr. So two different separate practices, but both translating into magic in order to prophesize, for example, in Valuespal, which Valuespal, like Volva Spau. Spau is like a vision, right? And value refers to Volva. So Volva were the staff bearers. They were like the wise women. Some people translate that in the witch, but I just don't think that's accurate because I think the cultural differences between a witch and a Volva were notable. So they're not the same thing. And another aspect of Norse sorcery was the practice of utiseta, which translates into sitting out, which does not seem to have been a specific ritual so much as a technique to put other rituals into effect, clearly related to Odinic communications with the dead. And it breaks down all of these in this book. So if you want to pick up this book and learn more about these types of magics, this is fantastic. The last section I want to jump to is page 57 in chapter 3. Okay, so here on this side of the page, if we examine the description of Odin's magical skills presented above in Yngling Saga 7, we can first note that Seiðr is only one category among several. It is in fact possible to discern a certain pattern based on type of ability and the form of sorcery, which we note here a word, which I think is a more clear and precise way of referring to magic if you're talking about North Scandinavia, and that is Fjölkynngi, which translates to much knowing, is Snorri's collective term. So Fjölkynngi is what Snorri called it, Snorri Sturluson, with which was associated. So there's Galdr and runic sorcery, and this included items like shape-shifting, ethereal travel, control of fire, wind, and water, conversation with men in their graves, various forms of helping spirits, and transport with a magical ship. Then there's Seiðr, which is considered a separate category, divining the future, killing, inducing sickness, inflicting misfortune, depriving people of their wits, or augments, so, making them crazy, depriving people of their strength, other skills, and then it also lists Fjölkynngi under this, so there's other things that Seiðr could do, which was similar to the other practices. So this breakdown in this table and this grid on this page is a fantastic reference as well. But all of this stuff, in my opinion, reiterates what I'm trying to bring up with my point that Seiðr is not the same thing as saying magic. It is a type of magic. And I myself prefer to use the term Fjölkynngi. Now, in some of the notes that I have taken, because I like to take notes on stuff like that, I have a huge list of terms. And the terms that I've listed out was, for example, Fjölkynngi. And then there is Seiðr, Galdr, Spau, Gandr, Kingi, Hamfjörfjör, Hamskithtir, Taufer, Utisetta, and those are just some of them. And the Hamfer is to assume shape through an incantation or charm. The point I'm trying to get at is it seems like each of these are different types of skills, and I don't know if anything specifically says the exact way to practice them. Like if you're going to use a Galdr, what do you say? What are the exact words or sounds, and what's the tone? What does it sound like? People have tried to reconstruct it, which is why I almost suggest that those who are interested find something else, but don't label it under this label that we don't know much about. There's a lot of people who've tried to reconstruct it. There's a lot of cultural things that have survived that might fit into those categories. And I'm doing more research. as I'm trying to find out, like maybe there's more, and I'm going to dig through this a couple more times. I'm going to read through it a couple of times, and there's other sources that I want to check out and read into, but it usually seems like they're referencing about versus the how to. So that's the point that I'm trying to get to with a lot of this. There's a lot of stuff that's out there, and there's a lot of people that make these claims, but without backing it up with sources, we're just throwing things under a label like people do with the term witchcraft. Everyone says everything is witchcraft. They're not specifying what witchcraft is. But if someone says it's something negative, they get mad and say, that's not what it is. But we don't have a definition for what it actually is. What specifically defines it as witchcraft? What specifically defines something as Seiðr? If we look at the sources, we see examples of actual Seiðr. We see examples of actual stuff. But we'll see again that this stuff is usually something that everybody knows about and it's common for everyone, like someone casting out a curse and saying something negative and having an effect versus ritualistic. And I think that's the distinct thing about Seiðr, and that's why I think that it's often translated as magic. I would almost argue that Seiðr specifically would be ritual magic. So instead of just being the whole term magic, which I would personally would say is Fjölkynngi, I would say that Seiðr itself is ritual magic. And then Galdr might be incantations, casting a spell, or something like that. And oftentimes we see runes used in association with it. Now notice that the runes, when they're mentioned, even if we go to the Saga of the Volsungs, where Seiðr learns from the Valkyries to put the Tiwaz rune on the hilt of a sword. Is it Tiwaz by itself? Is it numerous ones? Is there something that's said with it? When we see examples like the Kinvi amulet, we see whole scripts written out. We see words and phrases versus individual runes, but that's still not using them to read or divine the future like some people use today. So this is all presented as information for you to consider, to take in, to absorb, and come up with your own opinion on. If you have other sources or opinions, feel free to share them in the comments. It's important to talk about, discuss, and to move forward with these instead of just make assumptions and share false information. Anyway, as always, thank you for watching, and I will catch you in the next one.